Got it.
All right, welcome everyone for round three. So we went through a lot. We went through a lot. The first week, I'll do a quick little recap for of the essentials, though obviously this does not do justice to the idea content of what we all worked through, and anyone who's been there knows it. Um, the first week, we were just introduced to the essentials of what Lyndon LaRouche had done really in the 1960s as far as a discovery or a new insight into understanding economic processes, not as a monetary, but rather as a physical economic process that has something much more to do with science as well as art than most modern economists would believe. And this understanding of economics as science was much better understood as we've come to recognize through the writings of people like Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, Henry C. Carey, a long time ago, way before we were born. This concept was much more coherent in the minds of many of the better thinkers of the West. Today, it's been very confused, and the waters have been muddied quite a bit, to say the least. The reason why, I mean, I think that was clearly communicated in the works of Hamilton, that economics is the science of human happiness. It's the science of how do you not only sustain the existing human population, but how do you improve upon that population? So both maintain as well as improve upon, and that usually means the recognition that, well, we've got today what, 8 billion human bodies with souls all over the world. There are certain preconditions to maintaining that can only happen if you have certain rates of industrial production, certain means of producing food, certain types of technologies, and certain types of energy sources that previous societies could not have had access to when we only had maybe 500 million, 200 million or less people on the earth. So the relationship between discoveries, the fruits of discoveries, the effects of pure discoveries in the form of applied technologies, and how all of that relates to maintaining an improved potential of human populations is something which has been understood intuitively in even ancient times. You get a sense of it just reading some of the writings of Plato and of Augustine. You get a sense of that, but it became really coherent post-Renaissance of the West, when you had people like Gottfried Leibniz, that LaRouche hammers at quite a bit, as a figure who not only made important discoveries in the differential and infinitesimal calculus, was an opponent of both Isaac Newton, Descartes, as well as John Locke, and fought their poisonous ideologies tooth and nail throughout his entire life, but also established a system of political economy premised around the idea of how do you overcome the limits to growth? How do you always encourage cultural standards that both enhance the ability for individuals to make new discoveries, while at the same time finding more and more creative ways to translate those discoveries to the entire benefit of the system as a whole. That involves the transformation or improvement of educational practices. You can't just hold on to orthodoxy blindly, right? But you can't let go of orthodoxy, and you can't let go of traditions blindly either, as too many today are wont to do. It requires this balance of both respecting the universal traditions and principles that work, while at the same time embracing new creative discoveries that bring us more in alignment with God's creation. Change, no change, right? How do you make the two seemingly incompatible ideas of no change and change somehow dance together in an organic way, in a natural way? That's something which oligarchical systems don't get, or they refuse to get. Instead they would rather they acknowledge that there is change in human systems, but they would rather that change be controlled by the force of no change, by a crystallized state of stasis. And so LaRouche was able to introduce not only his forecasts that he had been making over the course of many, many decades, as well as the specific forecast of the current economic collapse that he was talking about in 2002 pretty coherently. But how do you avert these types of systemic crises, which requires not just making better policy, but recognizing that the way you've been thinking is wrong, right? And leading economists who have been trained in Harvard, Yale, Oxford, all of these ivory tower universities have all been mistrained to think about certain assumptions which again, LaRouche got at in a variety of ways, that are wrong assumptions. Number one, that you can conceptualize a human system, meaning the systems of production, the motion of goods, the consumption of goods, and all of your theories of pricing and interest rate manipulation and inflation. All of these theories you can build upon. If you think about them around the idea that what gives value to the economy is the people's desire to maximize their pleasure and avoid pain, the way certain thinkers like Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, so many would have us believe. If you think that, you're not going to understand what is a human economy properly. Similarly, if you think about the geometry in the space and the time in which human beings operate as being something which could be described in Euclidean terms, you're also not going to understand what is shaping the crises, or what would provide the pathways towards solutions from crises. You can't understand that if you think of Euclidean geometry as being what your world exists within. And I'm going to ask a question here. For those who are here, and maybe if you weren't here, do you have an idea of what a Euclidean geometry is when LaRouche said that, or when I say that? Can somebody give me an idea of what is a naive Euclidean? What are the essential characteristics of a naive Euclidean geometry?
To me, it's
limited postulates, planar, not necessarily spherical, geometry. For instance, you can't use the Euclidean geometry to realize that the shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere is a great circle route.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. That when you're dealing with a topography like a sphere, if that's your space that you're operating within, then what worked when you were in a lower two-dimensional flat space of thinking no longer applies to your higher three-dimensional volume space of curvature. Yeah, right. The rules break down. That's true.
You see that with celestial navigation too, Matt. Where when you're plotting things just in your comparatively tiny corner of the world, you can assume that everything's a plane. But what you're doing is you're translating great circle routes in the heavens, in the celestial sphere, into something usable to a navigator or the captain of a ship to get from A to B. So that's an example of which I have some working familiarity.
Right, of course. Yeah, and you're using like Mercator projections, right, of a spherical mapping of the stars onto a flat surface. So you're using a projection of sorts, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's a good example. Yeah. Kelly, you were going to contribute a thought?
Oh, I was just going to say, to me, Euclidean means seeing things in 3 dimensions, X, Y, and Z, and maybe even time, but that's it.
Euclid started with points and said line. You have lines that are made up of points.
And how did he define points?
They have 0 width and 0 dimension, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's the big fraud. I love that. Yeah, that's right. That one of the core axioms, the core assumptions that Euclid would have us believe, like Kevin just said, is that lines are two-dimensional and they're made up of points, right? Lines only have height or width, whatever. They only have one dimension. They only have width, but they don't have height or breadth. And he also says a surface is like an infinite array of lines, which have only width and breadth, but no height, right? And a volume is a three-dimensional space that is made up of width, breadth, and height. But then he says, here's the see if you can see where the mind fuck happens. He says, as Kevin just pointed out, lines are made up of infinite points, he says. And a point is defined as that which has no width, breadth, or height. Do you see where the brainwashing happens?
Something for nothing.
Yeah.
Everything that seems to be something is actually made up of a bunch of nothings, infinite nothings, actually. And how do you add a whole bunch of infinite nothing, these points together to get somehow a something, a line, right?
Matt, they actually analyzed that conundrum on a recent television show, Young Sheldon. You know, with the slow kid living next door to Sheldon, couldn't figure out the difference between 0 and nothing, and neither could Sheldon. He brought it to his 2 physics professors, and they resolved it by saying, "Well, let's believe in 0."
That's funny. That's
That one's a big conundrum, isn't it? Even philosophically, that's a big conundrum.
well. This is something Plato was poking fun at in his in the Zeno paradox, right? This idea that if you think about it, if you think about space in that naive Euclidean way, that involves all like a distance as being just a line that could always be divided and subdivided forever, there is no way you could possibly go from point A to point B, because you'd always be passing through an infinite having, right? Which would result in you never getting anywhere. But then, you know, you could throw an apple at a tree and that apple hits the tree. So there's obviously a different character to space than that stupid, naive mathematical abstraction, which can get our minds into all sorts of intellectual knots. And you won't see things like, you know, like you could say mathematically, well, or like from that ivory tower standpoint, well, if I just blow a bubble gum and just keep on blowing it, that I can imagine a sphere in my ivory tower, you know, imaginary abstract space. I can imagine a sphere that's super tiny, that just always gets bigger and expands and expands. A sphere is a sphere, it's eternal. But as soon as you start looking in the real world, right, and we start looking at like a hubba bubba bubble gum blowing up, all of a sudden you might imagine that could always blow infinitely into the future, right, as ever getting bigger. But the reality is there are physical forces that your naive geometry doesn't presume exists, which will cause it to blow up in your face. And that's the problem with economists today. So all of those economists throughout the 1970s and 80s who have been making linear projections talking about how you could just make money with money and make different types of collateralized debt obligations, right? And then speculate on the value based on the futures and the spot markets of what the insurance on these debt obligations that are bundled are going to be. You know, there's so many creative financial instruments that all projected infinite growth, monetary growth, not ignoring the real world, while the real world suffered an atrophy of the powers of production, right? Canada, the US, we lost our factory base. We lost our means of producing infrastructure, building new things. We lost it all as we became more and more based upon services. So we could see the rate of growth of the monetary, the financial system just blowing up. And nobody saw that we were imposing new boundary conditions in the physical universe that were resulting in a collapse function we were bringing onto ourselves because we chose to stop looking at reality. So now we've got reality slamming us like a bus, you know, really fast, really hard, and we have choices to make. So LaRouche, again, he was going through, well, what are non-Euclidean geometries? What are examples of that? And he threw out some examples that we talked about last week of Johannes Kepler, and how Johannes Kepler, the great German astronomer, created a new standard of physical science through his work on Pythagorean geometries, and proving that he basically spent 30 years of his adult life demonstrating that the Pythagorean hypothesis of the harmonies of the planets was actually valid. It hadn't been fully proven until he came around and produced his 3 laws of the Kepler's laws, right? He proved those, which we still use to this day. And it also has application in microphysics, which is important because those who have abandoned the Keplerian method, which was used by people like Max Planck, people like Albert Einstein, who were at the heart of creating a new type of approach to physics over a century ago, they were all utilizing in varying degree a Keplerian method, and they talked about it. They talked about the importance of Kepler's method. Those who we learn about today, so these are the founding fathers of quantum physics. but those quantum mechanic godheads who we're taught we have to use as models when we think about the atom are the people who never made any discoveries, right? They're the young statisticians and mathematical, fetishists like Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli, who, again, they never made discoveries. They only made explanatory models based on probability theories, built up elegant models that might have looked pretty, but they never made discoveries. And they basically said, following Niels Bohr, that Kepler, Plato is all irrelevant. The belief in the assumption that there is truth is irrelevant. We can only assume that there is probability, a science of maybes. And that's all we have, rolling of the dice. And so that's the sort of tools that both physicists, as well as mathematicians, as well as cosmologists are all being given, these crappy tools that they think that they have to use when they get out of university to go and actually practice their craft and get published, that have no bearing in the actual fruitful techniques that gave rise to the great discoveries. So from there, LaRouche just quickly added to that a little bit to get across that the current of Western physics, out of which the anti-Euclidean geometries of Kepler evolved and continued in a fruitful, unbroken fashion, involved the discoveries of Leibniz, whose concepts of the calculus came out of his Keplerian method. These, again, take note, don't necessarily believe what he's saying, but take note and try to prove him wrong. That's what I've done. That's what a lot of people I know have done. And it's a fruitful exercise. And out of Leibniz, there were people like Gauss we were introduced to, Carl Friedrich Gauss, Wilhelm Weber, who worked with Gauss on electrodynamics, as well as the question of the magnetic field of the Earth itself, which has certain characteristics that are of an anti-Euclidean nature. And most importantly, Riemann, who LaRouche says provided the best language for real economists to understand how to measure the potential relative population density, and which means essentially, as LaRouche gets across in his Science of Economics, what beyond simply the actual real population levels, more importantly, is the potential population. And so if you do things that expands your potential, you're doing the right thing. If you're applying new discoveries that make your productive powers of labor better, you're doing the right thing, right? You can move into, you can grow into a bigger space that you create for yourself by these new nonlinear discoveries. If you do like the World Economic Forum fanatics would have us do, which is shut down our viable energy sources, shut down our fertilizer and our food production, and forget about actual meeting the needs of people. If you create scarcity, then you can contract your potential, and sometimes that contraction of potential might even make the potential fall below the actual population levels, and then you get a Pygmalion effect, right? Where then those who have been saying, the Malthusians who had been arguing that we're overpopulated, all of a sudden have empirical data to say, look, it's true now, isn't it? You thought we were lying, and they, what's obviously dirty about this is they were the ones lighting fires in the village, telling you fire was bad. If we allow fire to happen, it's going to cause, mass death. So we abandoned fire, but we forgot the fact that the people who caused us to see villages burn were the arsonists, who were the ones trying to make the argument that fire is bad. So nuclear energy is bad. Hydrocarbons are intrinsically bad. All of these things are bad. So it's a sophistry, and it's a dishonest thing. And so this brings us, I think, now to the current problem of sense perception. And that's what we're going to start looking at today. Is the new section is what is sense perception, and where does sense perception fail in such a way that the mind alone can understand how to see things that the eyes fail to see, which is important as well for every branch of science. So I'm going to do a little screen share here as soon as I can find my correct thing. Forgive me. Here it is. Okay, just looking at the chats here quickly. Peter said, can you add the background to Einstein's comment, God does not play dice with the universe? Yes, that's just in regards to his debates with Niels Bohr. Yeah. Niels Bohr being the Copenhagen School physicist who said, there is no causality, there is only randomness and probability, which made Einstein rightfully very uncomfortable. So let me just make this bigger. Okay, can people see the screen?
Yep.
All right. So, as I said, the new section is the trouble with sense perception. Who would like to be a reader today? Peter, okay, go for
it. Thanks, Teach. The trouble with sense perception. The central controlling issue of scientific principle in politics and in economics is implicitly whether or not man is simply another animal. Most present-day economists would not, and most probably could not, explain the difference competently. That is one of the several crucial reasons for the demonstrated incompetence amongst most of our leading economists today. The worst being the radical empiricists, such as the followers of Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann. The principle of natural law, called variously the general welfare or common good, pivots upon the evidence that man is not merely another form of animal life, but has a distinct quality, expressing a universal physical principle which is absent in the beasts. This crucial evidence proving the existence of this quality is typified by fact of the power to generate valid, revolutionary discoveries of experimentally verifiable universal principles. The difference in effect flowing from the acceptance or rejection of this principle is the proper basis for defining all civilized law. When the principle is efficiently understood as both a universal physical principle and a principle of equity. This quality is, therefore, the essential referent for all investigation of economic cycles. The basis for all proper constitutional law is, therefore, the notion that the conduct of man and the rights of man are to be derived from nothing other than the discernible implications of the specific quality of differences which set man apart from the mere beast. The scientific and therefore the legal conception of man and the governing intent of law must always be derived from the practical implications of this distinction. The substitution of a religious doctrinal tradition for science on this account does not provide proof of principle of law in the deliberations of a sovereign nation state. Plausible sincerity of assertions of belief is never rightly admissible as evidence of a witness's truthfulness. These principles of law have axiomatic authority in the domain of physical economy and of policies of practice which affect the outcome of practice bearing upon the physical economy as a whole. Violations of those principles of physical economy are the principal cause of all of the economic catastrophes which a modern nation state may inflict upon itself. The so-called ecological difference between mankind and the animal species is that the sovereign power of cognitive potential, which is specific to the human individual, does not exist among the beasts. Cognition signifies the power of an individual human mind to form a successful hypothesis as the solution to a well-defined ontological paradox, and to verify that hypothesis by the quality of experiment required to demonstrate that hypothesis to represent a universal physical principle. From the standpoint of animal ecology, a variety of a species of beast has a systemic ability to adapt to its environment in a way which is defined by a combination of ostensibly fixed genetic and kindred characteristics. With mankind, it is different. through the discoveries of universal physical principle, which are generated through the sovereign cognitive powers of the individual, mankind is able to increase what animal ecologists might describe as its relative ecological potential as a species. That, in a fundamental way, a way not found among higher apes and other beasts. This is the basis for my own central contribution to the science of physical economy, the notion of potential relative population density. If
Just
I
quick,
use ecology
when he
here-
said ontological paradox, do people have a general idea of an example of what he might mean with such an ontological paradox, or what he means by the term ontological paradox?
Well, why not start with the big one, the Parmenides paradox?
Go on.
Okay, that is truly the paradox having created the Western philosophy, or I would say even human philosophy, okay? So how do you explain changes when everything seems to be the same? Or how do you explain the reality of being when everything seems to change?
That's essentially it. That's essentially it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we did not answer completely to that question at this stage.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, because things keep changing
Keeps
Yeah,
things keep
but
changing.
still,
with new
But
discoveries
still-
all the time.
Exactly.
I know
how
you're
would
aware
there
of
be
the,
constancy.
I know, Matthew, you're aware very much of the electric universe theory, but there's one that's changing the, the paradigm considerably, and it's all done through experimentation. It's not done through mathematical models, etc., etc. And some of it is absolutely fascinating.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're generally, and I mean, for those who don't know, the electric universe is a very wide field, but it's essentially, it characterizes people who are thinking outside of the standard model norms of what we're supposed to believe physics is, with all of the core assumptions, and they don't believe that. So that's the best thing. It doesn't mean that that everybody who is part of the electric universe crowd is all equally true, but they all are utilizing a fruitful method of thinking, which doesn't assume certain ivory tower assumptions about space, time, and matter are true. And that humility gives these people such a degree of creative edge to discover things that are like slapping you right in the face. But many physicists, because their intellectual models don't permit for the existence of this thing slapping them, it doesn't exist. That in short term. So it's a very interesting idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to add a linguistic element to make people understand and remember, okay, what is ontology, okay? Because after all, ontology is a fancy word and it's synonym. Metaphysics is another fancy word. But if you understand the true meaning of both words, you will never forget what is a metaphysical or ontological paradox, okay? So ontology is from two Greek words, ontos, being, and logos, the speech about something. Okay, so it's the speech about being, or the thing that doesn't change. And it's synonym. Metaphysics is also from two Greek words, meta, after, and physics, nature. Okay, physics is from physis, meaning nature. So after nature. If you replace nature by senses perception, it's exactly what is this paragraph it's dealing with, okay? After sense perceptions, meaning how do you explain the deeper layer after or under or above or beyond, okay? You choose the word you like. The first layer of senses perception data.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I'd like to add, like, metaphysics goes, like, science only goes so far, and our thinking, and then where science stops, to me, that's where metaphysics takes over.
No, I would say that the strength. Well, that's another paradox. I'm happy you asked that question, Kelly, because metaphysics is before science, with science, and after science. Okay, even if its name means after nature, because a metaphysical foundation is the roots of reality, if you want. That's being. Okay, so. The question is, how is that our sense of perception when tell us that everything is changing? Okay, the seasons, your appearance with time, the flow of rivers, etc. You can give plenty of example, but there's something that doesn't change. Okay, and that is ontology, the speech on being, on that something that doesn't change, or what is after nature or under nature or beyond nature. Okay, so metaphysics is present before experimental science, during experimental science, and beyond experimental science. It's the universal knowledge.
Yeah, I got a quick, simple example of that I love that. It's not only before, during, and after. It's both. It's both and more. But think about something as simple as like the cup. This cup here, right? Scientifically, how would you define this cup? Right? You could weigh it. You can like get the frequencies of color, right? Of the light that is like hits the substance that is reflected off of it. Some of that light is absorbed, some of that is reflected off it. So you've got certain pigment, right? It's different ways you could measure it, occupying a certain idea of space. But the purpose of the cup is not really located anywhere in the descriptive domain, right? Like, why is the cup? That question of why is the cup is not contained in any of the descriptive language you might want to come up with. And there's infinite amounts of data you could glean from this cup, but none of that data gives you the purpose of the cup. So the question of like causality, why, that is something which is beyond, it is knowable, but is beyond the actual substance of this cup itself as a physical object. That requires you to go to start seeing with the mind's eye as a simple idea.
Exactly. And let's not forget that the first philosophical question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Okay.
Why the universe? Yeah.
Okay. So that's the absolute proof that there is something called the soul. Okay. No animals would ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
You were talking about the cup, you could weigh it, you could look at it. You can also tell something about the cup just by the fact that you said the name cup. And then just by saying the name, it gives me a vision of like an object that's, it's got an inside and outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're in the description, Kelly.
Yeah, the description will give you no knowledge of its function.
Yeah.
Why is the cup there? What purpose is the cup serving?
Yeah. That's physics, is nature.
So Kelly, here's the question. Easy, not a trick question, Kelly. How would you say the answer? What's the answer? Why is this cup?
Why is this cup?
Yeah.
You can drink.
I said that to drink.
I've been taught it was for drinking.
I was taught
drinking
to hold liquid to make it easier to drink. Yeah, exactly that. And that's a nice, satisfying, simple, clear answer, not located in the physical aspects of the cup per se. It's tied to intention, right? Idea, right? And that's easy when it's a human-made thing. Our minds are more ready to go there. But then when it's something that is created not by humans, like what? And I'm not saying give an answer right now, but this is what LaRouche is alluding to. What's the purpose of, let's say, chlorophyll? Could it be said that there is a purpose, or what's the purpose of the planets being in the locations that we find them around a sun? What's the purpose of the sun within a broader galactic network of other suns within a solar system, within a galaxy? Or what's the purpose of human beings and what's the purpose of animals, right? That's where oftentimes you'll get a meltdown of nihilists and existentialist philosophers who just can't emotionally go there because it implies too much. It implies too much, right? There's too much that they have to then, it's very subjective, that has to be reevaluated inside of their own hearts, which they don't have the strength to necessarily do. But it's a big question. If we can allow that there is the possibility that design, intention, and purpose exist in all of nature, that changes everything about how we think of human beings, economy, the difference between man and higher apes. Everything has to change. But a materialist would say human beings are very similar genetically to chimpanzees, right? We all want food. We all want to avoid pain. We have 5 fingers, and so the laws of the jungle apply to human beings. And if you want to manage human beings, you just look to the jungle, and that's all they say, right? And their minds just stop. And that's exactly the ontological paradox, because other animals can't have more than a few million of their species, whereas human beings clearly have several billions. We're several orders of magnitude larger in quantity as well as quality of life that no other species exhibits. So the question is, either that's just a mistake. We've been maintaining error for long enough, and we forgot that we're just supposed to act and think and behave like monkeys, or there's something higher animating our identities that doesn't make monkeys bad, but it does make us better than monkeys. And if that's the case, then a whole bunch of other consequences have to follow. And that's an ontological paradox that's embedded in that. So that brings us up now to the question of ecology, because a lot of poor ecologists today don't understand this. They're taught not to understand this, and this is where we left off.
Here I go.
Yeah.
If I use ecology here in the sense of animal ecology, as I do, this is not to be read as adopting the methods of animal ecology for man. Quite the contrary. It is to employ the experimental implications of the Socratic method of negation, as Pasteur, Curie, and Vernadsky et al. Did for defining the existence of a non-abiotic class of universal physical principle, a principle which does not exist within the bounds of principles extant in an experimentally defined notion of what might be assumed, often, if wrongly, to be an original abiotic universe. That a process identified as living is shown to be able to produce effects in an abiotic medium which could not be generated within an axiomatically abiotic domain, is the experimental basis for the definition of life by the succession of Pasteur et al. The distinction between,
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. The distinction between man and animals may be shown in a similar way by showing that human behavior accomplishes a physical effect which could not occur within the axiomatic bounds of an animal ecology. Any competent teaching and practice of economics, including forecasting, is premised on an understanding of the crucial importance of those threefold categorical distinctions among experimentally defined phase spaces. However, that is not sufficient. This brings us to a crucial subtopic of my hitherto unique achievements in long-range forecasting, the functional notion that certain principles of classical artistic composition are also universal physical principles. Without examining economic processes from the included standpoint of the role of social relations in defining possible forms of scientific cooperation around the discovery and use of the universal physical principles of both abiotic and living organisms, it is impossible to account for the way in which long-range economic cycles or kindred processes have been ordered in previous history. This functional distinction between man and the lower living species is otherwise expressed in an essential way by the functional distinctions between sense perception and knowledge. As I shall indicate here, My original discoveries in the science of physical economy were derived from further development of the argument I crafted first as an adolescent, in which I refreshed at the close of the war, for refuting the attack on Leibniz by Immanuel Kant. I signify that attack, which had been the central feature of Kant's notorious series of critiques. Through this approach to refuting Kant, I was able to define the meaning of cognition in a fresh way and continue to improve upon the definition later. The result was not inconsistent with the outcome of the spiritual exercises better known as Plato's series of Socratic dialogues, nor with Leibniz's insight into the principle of Plato's dialogues, but my application was an original one, prompted chiefly in reaction to the influence of Leibniz on my studies. This discovery defined a method which subsequently proved itself to be peculiarly best suited to the task of accounting for the essential features of long-range economic cycles.
Who would like to read footnote 25?
Yeah, I'll do that for you.
All right, thanks.
This use of spiritual is neither gratuitous nor cute. In physical scientific method, the only rational definition of spirit is a manifest quality of an individual human mind. It is shown to exist by reason of the fact that the individual human mind has a physically efficient capability to accomplish what no other living species can do. Discover the kind of universal principle, physical principle, which can become known only through cognition. This implies the related significance that the induced replication of an individual's discovery of specifically cognitive ideas has the effect of transmitting a spiritual existence, that of the original act of discovery, for example, to future generations. As such cognitive products were transmitted to that individual from their origin in an ancient original discoverer of such a principle. Since the actions involved produce effects expressed as physical effects, the transmission of such ideas by stimulated replication of the act of discovery is also a physical effect, and thus a subject of crucial experimental verification. The greatest theologians known to me through my studies employ that method of spiritual exercises.
So far, so good. Feel free, anybody can at any point, for those, I know some people are here for the first time. If something really bothers you or you have a thought or question, chime in, don't worry about it. But otherwise, yeah. We're okay?
And, okay.
Good.
As I have presented the case in locations published earlier, the action of generating a valid discovery of a universal physical principle occurs only within the perfect security of the sovereign cognitive processes of an individual human mind. I shall explain some points on this matter of crucial relevance to economics during this immediate portion of the report. This fact of sovereignty presents us with a paradox. Since no person can observe directly the cognitive process of another person's generating a provable hypothesis.
Can we
how is
stop
it
a minute and,
Yes, yeah, sure.
and go back to that paragraph right before? Because that is extremely important.
Sure. Which one? This one right here?
The action of generating a valid discovery of a universal physical principle occurs only within the perfect security of the sovereign cognitive processes of an individual human mind.
Yes.
Bingo. That's like the whole reason we are in this war that we are in, isn't it?
Go on. Elaborate on your thought on that a little bit more.
This whole system is meant to keep us from discovery and growth.
Yes. In that sense, yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I don't think I even really have enough understanding yet to communicate it more clearly than that.
No, you're
but
right though. That's the key.
Everything that you're talking about, this Malthusian attitude that they have,
Yeah.
is meant to suppress the human spirit, soul, mind from growing and making new discoveries and prospering in the way we were meant to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ironic, right? Because that's the essential basis upon which human survival depends, is upon the maximization of the powers of individual thought in each of the units, the members of that species of the human species. We depend upon that. That's why like individuals are sacred, and there's a sovereign right to develop both as an individual, and a sovereign nation is made up of sovereign individuals. Otherwise, you don't have sovereign nations. And when an oligarchy always gets their tentacles, wrapped around their victim, part of their modus operandi are the deployment of techniques that subvert the utilization of our powers, our natural God-given powers of reasoning. And instead we start just memorizing formulas, or we're trained to just adopt the beliefs of authorities or consensus groups of experts instead of thinking for ourselves, at which point we lose the ability to just be ourselves.
And you keep talking about the parasite kills the host. That doesn't work so well for the parasite either.
Ironically too.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
And then perfect security refers to boundaries. I'm hearing healthy boundary is an idea that I think of when I hear perfect security. And when I hear the adjective sovereign, I am thinking both of individuals and nation states.
And collectives.
And
Yeah.
I can think of a synonym for sovereign is self-determining. I venture to say.
Yeah. Or tyrant, paradoxically, okay, because tyrant come from tyrannos, which in Greek means sovereign. So maybe the sovereignty of tyrants is only for them.
I'd like to believe that, Quan.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And well, I would like to come back because Susan's comment is very interesting and make me think about the Euclidean system. Okay, because Peter was talking of people and of nation states, but it's bigger than that. It's the system of representation of the world. Okay, which is transnational, and the Euclidean system can be something quite big to illustrate that point. The system by itself is a arbitrary representation of reality. Okay, that arbitrary representation of reality, because it intimidates us, or we let it intimidate us. We don't think for ourselves and we stick to those definitions, but we are not forced to accept those definitions. We can say it's a closed system giving certain definitions inside that system, but we are not bound to those definitions. Okay, so it depends of your attitude towards the Euclidean system. It's for sure that the oligarchy wouldn't promote that Euclidean system, which is only a certain representation of reality, as something maybe absolute. Okay, maybe because we let them intimidate us, or because we did not do our homework to think by ourselves. Okay, because after all, and I know, I think I said that some weeks ago, some months ago, it's not written on the preface of the Elements by Euclid that you don't have the right to change the axioms. Okay, but we have to write it for ourselves in our mind and our soul, that we can read a certain representation of the world, but it's not. We should not let it intimidate us into thinking that's the absolute representation of the world, being Euclidean geometry or anything else.
Yeah. And I think it's in the Republic that Plato specifically says that one can only begin to emerge as a true philosopher, like a true lover of wisdom, when one learns to no longer treat their assumptions as something that are immutable, but rather hypotheses that they have to test. And as soon as they do that,
Absolutely.
you're free. You can start thinking. If you think that
You remember,
something you have to just hold on to and sink with them under into the ocean, if they're not meant to float, no, sometimes you have to let go of a rock that was masquerading as a flotation device. You know, it was a bad hypothesis. You don't have to hold on to it.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that is the famous transition from the fake democratic man to the true democratic man. If you remember one of our conversations, in the sense that the fake democratic man will have the appearance of the true one. Okay, but he's not a true one because he did not kindle. He did not kindle his own thinking, but rather using formula. And the fake democratic man is precisely the thinking. Well, if you think to the people, the members of think tanks nowadays, they are perfect representation of fake democratic man or the new economists giving their fantasies, fantastic, but in the bad sense of fantastic theories. Those are the true, those are the fake democratic man, and they are truly there, as you said, Suzanne, to trying to intimidate people, because it's not because they try to intimidate that they will succeed if people are doing their homework to think by themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Well said. Well said. That was a good segue, Susan. Thank you.
You all are reminding me, I homeschooled my kids and I bought a phonics system to teach them to read with. And when I heard about the school systems doing this look-say method, I didn't even understand what people were talking about, because when I learned to read, they had phonics still. But when you think about it, especially when you're young like that, it's much easier to memorize things than it is to learn to learn.
Yeah. But Susan, what is the fancy word for to learn to learn? I am a lover of fancy words. What is the fancy words for to learn to learn?
I don't know.
That's the word that we use very often in this group. It's epistemology.
Okay.
Epistemology, yeah.
Okay. And I get hung up a little bit sometimes with your accent. Was the word you were using, was it arbitrary?
No, the fancy word.
Okay. Say the word arbitrary the way you say it.
Arbitrary.
Okay. Okay. That was a couple of paragraphs ago. I got hung up on trying to figure out one word and then lost everything else you were saying. Anyway, I'm going to mute now. Thank you.
But epistemology is key. That's key. Thank you, Susan. And thank you. Yeah, thank you, Kwan. It's really that's the study of causality of all histories and the battle, the epistemological battle between sets of ideas about ideas. And how do you come to ideas? That's right. That's it. So let's maybe reread. Go to the beginning of that paragraph that you just started, and let's go from there.
As I have presented the case in locations published earlier, the action of generating a valid discovery of a universal physical principle occurs only within the perfect security of the sovereign cognitive processes of an individual human mind. I shall explain some points on this matter of crucial relevance to economics during this immediate portion of this report. This fact of sovereignty presents us with a paradox. Since no person can observe directly the cognitive process of another person's generating a provable hypothesis, how is it possible to organize effective cooperation in society's use of such universal physical principles? Discovery of principles is always an individual act of a sovereign individual mind. However, this is paradoxical in the Socratic sense, since technological progress in society does not occur through the bare discovery of such a principle by a single discoverer. The will and knowledge needed for effective cooperation in use of any discovered principle is a product of a social process, not a purely individual action. Thus, the demonstrably perfectly sovereign quality of individual cognition presents us with a true ontological paradox. What? That's a place to stop, because he's at least Matt, I forgot which one of the dialogues it was, but it may have been one of those when Socrates is about to depart this plane, and they're talking about the soul and reincarnating into, if the soul had led a virtuous life, it might reincarnate into a social animal. They're talking about a bee or an ant. Is there a connection between here? Because he's talking about individuals, fulfilling themselves, yet they can't fulfill themselves as individuals. They need other people.
Need a collective.
Yeah.
Uh,
Juan, what are your thoughts on this?
at the end of the Republic, in chapter 10 or book 10, Plato was alluding to reincarnation and to drink the water of the river Lethe, Lethe meaning forgetfulness in Greek, okay? But that's the only allusion to that. But here, I think it's much, much more in my mind in relation with the Meno, okay? Because the demonstration of the, leading to the solution of the geometrical problem, because precisely of the perfectly sovereign quality of individual cognition, okay? Because what happened in the Meno? Socrates asked the right question to the boy slave, and even if the boy slave is socially a slave, he still retained his sovereign quality of individual cognition if guided properly by the right question. I think it's more in that epistemological dimension.
Well, yeah, I mean, good point. I think definitely in so many of Plato's dialogues, he dances around the idea of the one and the many, and how do you resolve the seeming the apparent difference between the one and the many. In everything there's a multiplicity, right? You could break everything you could think about down into parts, but there's still a one that animates the behavior of each of the parts within the whole. And how do you, on a purely logical, like on computer level thinking, one and many seem like the two most opposite things you could come up with. Nothing is more different from one than many, but yet they coexist in reality. And so Plato is always thinking about that. And I think, yeah, both in the Meno dialogue, even in the Phaedo, but really, yeah, in the Meno. And what LaRouche is saying here is this fact that, yeah, we are individual sovereign ones. We are unique in that sense, but we're not, our unique experiences of discovery themselves are not contained as in a vacuum outside of a social process of a context, right? And the fruits of those discoveries don't exist in a vacuum either. It only has efficient existence that benefits anything good and that creates value when it's reproduced in the minds of other people. And each time that same discovery is replicated, it's replicated in each individual sovereign mind. But it's still one discovery, but it has, you can't say it's, it's not like you're programming a bunch of computers to do the same thing. It's different that way. So you've got this dance
because
one of the many.
Each of the extra minds can take that simple idea, that one idea that you're talking about, and expand on it.
Yeah.
Take it in a different direction. So, That's one of the most important qualities of a community.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. I think that the idea is maybe because that we are all sovereign. Okay, let's not forget the question at the beginning of the paragraph. Okay, since no person can observe directly the cognitive process of another person generating a provable hypothesis, how is it possible to organize effective cooperation in society, use of such universal physical principles? And here, since everyone has a sovereign mind, there's no need to have a direct access into the mind of the other, okay? Because we know that we all share our humanity, and since we have that sovereign mind with which we can create and discover things, it's because of that common nature of capacity to create that we can communicate and work together.
Well said.
MK Ultra proves that.
Did you say MK Ultra proves that?
Yeah. Subverts that.
Right. Subverts that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But bringing it down, yes.
Yeah. Well, but
Oh, yeah.
that sort of gets at the question of like, well, just as the question is, are there certain common characteristics of the mind of each individual that will be constant when a fruitful, genuine act of discovery is made? Are there common characteristics, regardless of whether you're African or European or ancient Greek or living 5 million years in the future? Are there certain common characteristics of fruitful discoveries? And also, are there certain common characteristics of derailing fruitful discoveries into their illusionary surface appearance with none of the substance, right? Are there acts of the mind that create false wind eggs, as Socrates calls them? You know, an egg is something that denotes potency, right? A wind egg is something which has the appearance of having potency, but when you break the shell, there's nothing there. It's just wind. You know.
Nothing but
Kevin, repeat that when you're not on mute.
nothing burgers.
Nothing burgers. Yes. And that's MK Ultra, I think, you know, and like any type, that's one expression at least of the subversion of the healthy creative mode of thinking and feeling, which go together. How do you pervert that and give people a false sense of having discovered something of substance, but none of the reality of it? You know.
And MK Ultra is a bad example. It's too old. They've got better techniques now.
Yeah, it's been normalized, but anyway, I think.
Yeah.
No, they don't need techniques now because it has been generalized to all the society by the general matrix.
Right. Yeah.
It's better than a technique.
Yeah. Creepy.
Sadly.
Let's round this thing out. Let's get to the next section.
Okay, last paragraph. This in turn generates a nice nest of multiply connected, subsumed ontological paradoxes. For example, since we can know that a discovery is valid only through its efficient effect in a social setting, how can cooperation and use of that principle be organized within society? Since the maintenance of the human species requires the transmission of accumulated successive advances in such knowledge of universal physical principles, it is the ordering of the related social relations within a society or among societies and from generation to generation, which defines the possibility of a society's realizing the benefit of such discoveries and transmitting the accumulation of such cognitive experiences from one generation to the next.
Damn. That's good.
Human supergenes. Consequently, the essence of human nature does not lie in the mere reporting of sense experiences or tricks as information from one individual to another, but rather the prompting of the cognitive processes of one individual to replicate the cognitive act of discovery of a universal principle which has been made by another. It is that cognitive aspect of social relations which defines an individual relationship to previous generations over thousands of years, or more, and similarly to future generations. It is that aspect of social relations which distinguishes the human individual as an integral part of humanity as a whole from the individuality of the mere beast. It is that relationship which expresses on the largest possible scale the proof of an absolute distinction between man and the beasts. You know what, when I was reading those two paragraphs, Matt, you know, I was thinking of the learning that takes place at a family dinner table around Passover, when they're one of the things that they exhort everybody present to think, hey, this didn't happen to Moses 3,330 years ago. It's happening to you right now, and it's going to happen to your kids and your kids' kids, and make it real that way. And that's the sinews that tie the words that you can't see the things that tie the words together, but that's the message that's coming through.
Can you expand on that a little bit more? Like when you because I'm ignorant. When you said this is not happening to Mo, or this didn't happen to Moses, this is happening to you. What's the context or what's being said at the table? Because
becoming free is something that every individual is experiencing in every generation, and the idea of slavery didn't just happen 3,333 years ago.
Right.
You know, to relate it, to try to put
yeah.
Exodus. I mean,
I hear you.
You know,
yeah, right.
Slavery and freedom are happening now, and they're going to happen tomorrow, and you got to make it real today.
I like that.
Here.
I like that a lot. That's good. Yeah, because you take for granted, when you think of the idea of freedom having been created, like, one in 1776 or thousands of years ago, when Moses challenged Pharaoh, and it makes you complacent, and it puts your sentinels to sleep sometimes when you're like, okay, the fight for freedom was won back in whatever date I'm attached to. And then you're like, well, wait a minute. No, every generation has to relive that experience in order to keep their sentinels on guard to defend from those who would wish to take away your freedom, which never, the oligarchical system was never extracted or extinguished. It's still there working its devious ways, with new costumes, generation to generation, and they want us to fall asleep for a few generations. So we don't mind sleepwalking into a slaughterhouse. That's a good idea that you had there. That's good.
Thank you. The matter does not end there. The ability to demonstrate that transmittal of discoveries of knowledge of universal physical principle is universally efficient in this universe is a definition of truth. For example, what I have just written is demonstrably true, but it is nonetheless highly debated. The empiricists, Kantians, and logical positivists, like the anarcho-syndicalists, for example, disagree most vehemently with what I have just reported here. The Kantians, for example, would deny the existence of knowable truth. The radical positivists and existentialists, especially the sociologists of that curious persuasion, would go into a frenzy like that of angered rhesus monkeys in a cage and do if the issue of truthfulness were raised in their classroom.
The footnote 26 there is the Frankfurt School existentialists as examples, Theodor Adorno and Hannah Arendt, for example. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. The point respecting that quality of difference between man and beast, which I have just summarized, is the most hotly contested issue of all modern civilization. It is, for example, the issue posed by the true statement, as by me, that information theory is one of the most monstrous and most destructive of the hoaxes popularized during the recent 60 years. The issue arises in a general way by posing the inherently paradoxical question whether knowledge is located within the domain of sense-perceptual experience as such, or whether human knowledge must be defined as of the form of experimentally demonstrated cognitive generation of universal physical principles. Footnote 27.
Paul, you want to read that?
In modern European history, this conflict was centered early around the figure of Nicholas of Cusa. The cases of the irrationalist Wenck and Henry VIII's Venetian marriage counselor, Georgi Zorgi, are typical. as are Pietro Pomponazzi and later the author of modern empiricism, Paolo Sarpi.
This method of transmission of discoveries of universal physical principle, not only from one individual to another, but over successive generations, obliges us to define cognition in a way which goes beyond the argument of Vernadsky, and that in a qualitative way rather than in degree of refinement. We are implicitly obliged to recognize the existence and role of a class of phenomena unique to human social relations, phenomena which we might best term supergenes. For this, we resort to the same experimental method of negation, by means of which living processes are distinguished from abiotic ones and cognitive from animal life. Footnote 28.
I have referred to this phenomenon of supergenes in earlier locations, but the present setting provides the medium in which to state the case in a more thorough way.
The relevant argument goes as follows. Since the act of cognition occurs only within the perfectly sovereign cognitive processes of individual mentation, the act cannot be transmitted in that form from one mind to another. It can be transmitted only by replication. This does not leave the equivalence of the act occurring in two distinctly separate mental processes a mystery. The experimental method enables two minds to be certain of the equivalence of their discovery, once the relevant, crucial form of experimental proof of the coincidence has been achieved. On this account, we are able not only to speak with certainty of an absolute distinction between man and the lower forms of life, but to define that distinction as the essential quality of social relations among the members of our species. On this account, there is no essential equivalence between animal and human behavior, except to the degree men and women are bestialized in both their sense of identity and behavior. Indeed, the proper notion of evil is the notion of bestialized man, the notion of man typically associated with modern existentialists such as Nietzsche, Richard Wagner, Hitler, Heidegger, Adorno, Arendt, Sartre, et al. This notion of the specifically human quality of the cognitive form of social relations is not limited to the isolable individual act of verification of a replicated discovery of principle. Human nature is located essentially, primarily, in the way in which the cumulative effect of transmission of discoveries is expressed over successive generations. Study of this aspect of the matter requires that we recognize the existence of a phenomenon fairly described metaphorically as supergenes. The clearest expression of the function of such supergenes is found in the mode of transmission of knowledge of principles called classical humanist education. However, we must also take into account that such forms of communication of cognitive ideas are not limited to a formally classical humanist mode of education. It is readily demonstrated, if one takes the time and effort to demonstrate this, that the classical humanist mode is a concentrated expression of principles which have always operated among human beings, especially in the loving relationship with child and parents, as from birth, if not, as is probably the case, even while the infant is gestating in the womb. Ask, what is happening in the cumulative social process of transmission of cognitively generated and replicated experiences of discovery of experimentally demonstrable universal physical principles? What is happening physically? Very well. What should we mean by the use of the term physical? Without going beyond what Vernadsky has accomplished, the rational use of the term physical finds an adequate basis in those qualities of experimental demonstrations of principle, which are distinguished from one another by their distinctive form of regular physical effects. Thus, we define universal physical principles of an abiotic phase space by physical experiments which are coherent with the notion of an abiotic subuniverse. We define living processes, the biosphere, by means of physical effects which could not come into being in a universally abiotic phase space. We define the noosphere by physical effects which could not come into being within the experimentally defined confines of either an abiotic or biotic phase space, or both combined. This is therefore the only rational experimentally based method for the definition of the term physical.
Okay, there's a lot there.
Vernadsky,
There's a lot there.
yeah,
I guess I'll just give people a chance, just a quick little space here. If there's a problem or a question anybody has based on some of the dense content that was just introduced, feel free to share a thought or a question if you have one.
is Vernadsky the master of biochemical, geological processes all together and meshed?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's the founder of biogeochemistry as a field of study, a Russian scientist. But his one of his biggest contributions was to help people understand that the most fruitful way of thinking about space and time is to recognize that we don't just have one naive, like, at the beginning we were talking about Euclid. There's not just one Euclidean space or time on a timeline or in lines in space, none of that. It's rather that we have qualities of cognition, of life, and of life's absence, animating or not animating, the different organization of energy and matter, the atoms, the chemistry, the molecules that are ponderable and discoverable within the universe. Right. So some atoms in rocks, for example, are made of carbon and nitrogen. You'll find that in rocks, and you'll find carbon and nitrogen in a cantaloupe in varying degrees, and you'll find nitrogen and carbon in your body, right, as human beings, or even in your cat or whatever, right? So, but the difference, there's qualitatively different states of organization or principles that organize the behavior of those carbon and nitrogen molecules, or hydrogen, whatever you want to look at, right? And that's either going to be through the apparent absence of life, like in the rock, or in an ecosystem, you have the presence of life. And in human economies, where we have technology coming online and a lot more greater degrees of change happening, if we're being creative, then you have the additional factor of cognition. But here's the paradox. You can't get life from non-life. You can't get cognition from no cognition. You can't get something out of nothing, right? So the essence of the thing that is created must exist within its cause. That's one of the principles of Leibniz. That's also one of the principles of Vernadsky. And so the paradox then is, well, is it possible that there has ever existed or could possibly exist any space within the universe that is devoid of the life principle? Or must the universe be not only alive, but perhaps also shaped by mind? Maybe that's something which is more than just what humans do, right? But that rather the fact that humans do this makes humans quite special. But there's evidence of design, intention, purpose in all of the universe, including what seem to be on the surface non-living expressions of the universe. And that's just like, again, very dense set of paradoxes and discoveries that can be played with there. And it brings up the question of God, right, in a whole new way.
Yeah, sure does. Vernadsky's notion of the noosphere carries us through to the notion of the physical impact of individual cognition. I carry the same approach a step further than he does to the notion of the effect of a principle of cognitive social relations. Here we encounter another distinct physical effect defined in a manner consistent with the way Vernadsky defined the biosphere and the noosphere, to which I give the name supergenes. This effect reflects the physical basis for what is otherwise recognized as the methods and products of classical modes of artistic composition associated with the influences of such as Solon, Plato, Dante Alighieri, Leonardo da Vinci, Rembrandt, Johann Sebastian Bach, Kastner, Lessing, Moses Mendelssohn, Mozart, Goethe, Schiller, Beethoven, Hein et al. I digress. Bach. This is identified with the function of irony, metaphor, and the subjunctive in both classical modes of artistic composition and performance, and in the work of statecraft, as in physical science. All of these expressions of that principle of cognitive social relations have the useful name of classical culture. This means not only the transmission of what is explicitly and rightly distinguished as classical forms of culture, but also all social processes which express the same principle within them, whether or not the culture is otherwise meaningfully definable as classical or not. The accumulation of transmitted discoveries of principle of science and art combined over successive generations results in a type of individual and society which is more or less far removed in physical effect from a simple individual person with a cognitive potential in general embedded within his nature. This transformation occurs through the cognitive form of the special quality of social relationships expressed by the effective transmission of cognitively generated conceptions from one generation to another or across cultural currents. The effect of such transformations is equivalent in physical effect on the biosphere and noosphere to the same general effect as culturally affected genetic change, as genetic change would be observed in the character of a lower species or variety. Clearly, the effect of cultural transmissions of this cognitive type produce their characteristic physical effect in terms of the capabilities and other characteristic responses of the persons in whom that experience has had its effect. There is, in short, a change in the physical principle expressed by both the individual and the social relations among the individuals of the relevant culture. This is the effect which prompts theologians to locate the immortality of the mortal human individual as living in a simultaneity of eternity. The continuity of that continuing cognitive process within which the mortal individual exists is never broken. I'm thinking soul when he talks about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There are also reverse effects, virtual species downshifts, such as the pestilence of cultural decadence, which erupted in globally extended European culture during the recent 37 years of the so-called rock, drugs, sex counterculture. The significance of these issues is shown more clearly when we apply the method of very long cycles to the most crucial topics of theology. In the classical Greek treatment of the nature of God, as by Plato's dialogues, the idea of God appears in first approximation as a universal principle, or in Greek, a logos, the experimental proof that the principles underlying both life and cognition, respectively, are universal principles, signifies that no universe existed or will exist without their efficient anti-entropic presence within it. If creativity is a universal physical principle, as Vernadsky's approach suffices to define such a noetic principle, then it was always and everywhere efficient, existing in the form reflected as cognition within the human mind. I venture a footnote, John chapter 1, verse 1 through about 3. In the beginning was the word, etc.
Oh, you just contributed a footnote to this discussion.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's good.
Yet the universal physical principle of creativity is known to mankind only in the sovereign individual form of the act of cognition. Here, we are confronted with the same kind of argument made by Leibniz in his conceptualization of our universe as organized according to a monadology. Thus, to our knowledge, creativity exists sufficiently in the universe only as an expression of a perfectly sovereign being, a being which expresses his existence in such forms as those intentions which Kepler equated to universal physical principle. There's a footnote 30.
30. The argument which Leibniz summarized as the set of theses called his monadology was an outgrowth of and expression of Leibniz's uniquely original, circa 1676, discovery of the calculus. The emergence of the conception of a universal principle of least action in the course of his further development of the calculus poses the notion of a monadology implicitly, as I have argued for the sovereignty of the individual processes of cognition. Hence, the castration of the Leibniz calculus by Augustin Cauchy is to be seen as the third of a series of hoaxes by the apologists for Isaac Newton. The first was the discredited least action hoax of Berlin's Malperseus. The second attempt, after Malperseus's fraud was exposed, was the hoax of the letters to a German princess by Malperseus's Berlin confederate Leonard Euler. The third was the assertion by Laplace's accomplice Cauchy of the essential intent of Euler's hoax as the linear approximation passed down as customary classroom dogma since.
Yeah, the thing again, for those who aren't accustomed necessarily to reading a LaRouche essay, the best advice that I could come up with is to just have a little notebook handy, and whenever he introduces something provocative or a name or the reference to, let's say, Leibniz's monadology that you haven't looked at before or thought about, or like Euler's letters to a German princess from, I think it's like from 1747. Just take note, write it down. And then, structure your time in the course of the week to take a little bit of time to read Leibniz's essay or to read Euler's letters to a German princess and think, how does that fit into what Lynn had characterized or LaRouche had characterized about this, and then just write your questions down. And I think that's for me, one of the best things I've come up with for myself is writing my notes in the form as much as I can of writing questions that I have. And I always write like question to self, and you don't have an answer, but you're like that punctuates the question. Because sometimes when you read things and you have a good thought or a good question and you don't write it down, what happens? It fades away and you forget what it was. You're like, I had a really good thought. I had a good question. I don't remember what it was yesterday, So when you have a little notebook and you can revisit it and it gives it new color and new life. And sometimes you answer the questions, in the course of your readings. So just, have a little notebook.
Okay. Oh, there we go. It is the continuity of such a universe, through its included expressions as the human species and human history, which is subtended by the physical principle I have associated with the notion of super genes. The continuity of the cognitive creative principle has itself a sovereign identity, a quality of personality, as the creator himself exhibits this in creation considered in the large. So, although this is a physically efficient principle, it is also a spiritual principle, the reflection of a physically efficient power acting upon what we otherwise perceive as the physical universe. In that case, we are employing the term spiritual as a term of physical science, in the same sense that we employ the term life to distinguish the principal difference between a living and an abiotic process. These cultural processes, which I have associated with the notion of supergenes, plays a critical role in determining the characteristic features of long-range economic cycles. I shall address this effect at an appropriate point below.
Get it? All right, let me see. I think that's probably a good spot to end our reading for tonight, and we could just have a little dialogue before we close it off. Next week, when we meet up again, we'll just tackle it back with the new section on anti-entropy versus entropy, which I'm sure is going to be very provocative. But I think it's already 9:37. That's a perfectly good spot to stop it for tonight. So is that what everyone expected?
Oh yeah, even
it's
more
interesting.
So.
Essentials of economics.
Everything
not
I
the
expected
not the
and more.
economics I was taught.
Well, there's maybe an easy answer that I always use words to introduce easy answers, okay? Because if we don't use the word economy, but political economy, it's not a so big surprise, okay? Because political open a whole universe, contrary to, and I think precisely economics is precisely the production of fake democratic man making us forget the first part, which is political economy. And once again, political opens a whole universe.
I'd like to add something to what you said when you dissect words and look for Greek roots. Okay, the word political does make me think of polis, or the city,
Yeah.
the city state, and then economy is a joining of two words, ecos, which is the house, and nomos, which is the law. So we're talking about the law of the house and the law of the city state. So it's small grouping, an individual grouping, a small grouping of a house, and then of the city state, of the greater community.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Peter, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a fellow etymologist.
Well, my father was kind of like the character Michael Constantine played in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, because he always insisted that every word came from Greek somehow, and he work hard to prove it.
Well, that's part of my conspiracy theory, that the fact that Greek and Latin has been removed from the general education is precisely to bring down that classical quality, because you don't understand anymore the deeper meaning of the words.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. How could you have? Sorry, go on, Paul.
We're taught in our culture that, you know, where we are is more civilized than the ancients, but precisely what Quan and Peter are talking about, by understanding what they meant by certain terms that we take for granted, we use them all over the place, gives us a better idea that the insights that these people were describing, et cetera, were just as valid to us today as they were to them, provided we understand the nature of those insights. And I agree with you, Quan, we're being deliberately prevented from participating in an education system that helps us understand that kind of knowledge. This assumption that we are so much more advanced than the ancients is just rubbish.
Well, it's the count of mathematics as an absolute. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm a bit obsessed with the fake democratic man, because the fake democratic man are the tools of the oligarch to corral the people. Because precisely what we discussed this tonight, one of the big things that we discussed tonight, is that what is the difference between the science with soul or the science without soul? Okay, in the science without soul, you are intimidated into, well, it's not science, but let's use the word science. You are intimidated into believing in a certain representation of the reality given to you or stuff in your mind by the oligarchical system or the closed system precisely. And in the science with soul, you are taught to have critical thinking. It doesn't mean that you will reject everything, because if I go back to Euclidean geometry is not so bad, okay? It's only a certain representation of the world. And if you understand that it's only a limited representation of the world, it would not have its limiting effect that it had during maybe the last 2 millennia.
Yeah. You know,
an example of what I was just talking about in terms of appreciating people from yesteryear. Let me give you 3 quotes from 3 people that we have kind of discussed, one of which we discussed a little bit today: Newton, Descartes, and Leibniz. Okay, where am I? Just a little prologue first of all. Like in many mathematics and the sciences in their day, all three mathematicians were well read in ancient texts of philosophy and of course of mathematics, which for these men would have meant the text primarily of Euclid's Elements and also in texts of the Platonists, Neoplatonists and Hermeticists. In short, they knew something of the secret or esoteric tradition, and this was particularly true of Leibniz. Here's a quote from Descartes in relation to that. We see that the old geometers have made use of a kind of analysis which they extended to the solution of all problems, albeit they have hidden it from
Is it only
posterity.
me or Paul is not understandable now?
I'm tracking, Matt, I'm tracking Paul, okay.
Yeah, I'm following you too. I think it might be a little glitch on your end, Quan.
Sorry, Quan. I'll start that quote again. We see that the old geometers had made use of a kind of analysis which they extended to the solution of all problems, albeit they have hidden it from posterity. I well realize that they must have known a kind of mathematics that was very different from today's common one, not that I think they knew it perfectly. And indeed, some traces of this true mathematics seems to me still to appear in Pappus et Diopancus, who, though not belonging to the most ancient ages, lived many centuries before our times. I would also think that later one, it was suppressed by its very authors because of a certain wicked slyness. Now that was Descartes talking about his understanding and knowledge of the ancients.
What are you reading from right now, Paul?
I'm reading from a book by Dr. Joseph Farrell. It's called Thrice Great Hermetica in the Janus Age. I've mentioned before that I'm part of Dr. Farrell's online community. Okay, this one is from Newton. To be sure, the ancients' method is more elegant by far than the Cartesian one. For Descartes achieved the result by an algebraic calculus which, when transfused into words, following the practice of the ancients in their writings, would prove to be so tedious and entangled as to provoke nausea, nor might it be understood. But they accomplished it by certain simple proportions, judging that nothing written in a different style was worthy to be read, and in consequence, concealing the analysis by which they found their construction. And finally, Leibniz. The ancients seems to have recognized and possessed such an analysis proper to geometry, for in their works, I think I can make out some vestiges of it, namely of an algebra in which numbers are not the issue. Certainly, it is by this art that they unfolded those propositions. Otherwise, we would not have had them for such a long time, which only with difficulty would we find by using our modern methods. I think I have attained and discovered the foundation and the first lineaments of this art with which, once we have found the right symbols and established some principles, we can obtain everything else by an imitation of calculating, and with no need to follow the lines within our imagination, a result which I am not sure the ancients have ever attained. Now, my point simply there is that we're talking about three ancients for us, Newton, Descartes, Leibniz, and yet they're talking about the ancients for them as having a level of knowledge that they hid, perhaps, or that they themselves were only just beginning to, get some cognition of and some vague understanding of what the ancients were actually saying, which goes right back to this idea of having a better understanding of what the intention of the language used by ancients. We're talking about Greek and Latin here as languages, et cetera, et cetera. And I couldn't agree more that we miss out on so much when we run away from that kind of etymological roots of words and understanding, and I think LaRouche is doing a good idea, for example, of trying to get us to understand what he means, by the use of language and by the use of certain terms and everything like that. He's going into great detail. And I think it's important to do that. I really do.
Absolutely. And I would like to say that what is the name of the kind of school through which the British oligarchy
Sorry, Quan, you're breaking up terribly, mate. I cannot understand a word.
send their children? You maybe ask the question serious. My intention.
Quan, I'm so sorry. Your connection.
Okay. Okay.
Could you restate your thought question?
Try again.
Oh yeah. Okay. Now, did you guys hear me now?
Better now.
Yes, we hear you, Quan.
Okay, cool. So my question, and I It was on purpose that I make it a little bit mysterious.
Hmm.
What is the name of the kind of institutions that the British oligarchy send their children and their teenagers to? And you know the answer.
Boarding school.
Oh, boarding school.
Yes, but more
I think they
precise,
call them
because
public schools.
no, it's related to what Paul said. It's related to what Paul said.
Um,
Etymology, but there's a word for that. But it's not etymology, it's bigger than that. It's Tata school.
What's cool?
I said Tata for Ishtar is a syllable. So there is a word in 2 syllables, and after school.
Not finishing. That's 3.
Okay. I think that I let the suspense last long enough. Okay, it's called grammar school.
Oh,
Yeah.
grammar. Okay.
Grammar school.
Okay. Oh, just to say that the oligarchy wants their children to know the etymology, the rules of language, and so on. Okay, and even the school is called a grammar school.
Yeah. I would just be one thing that I've gotten as a sense in working through some of the writings of Leibniz and specifically his Leibniz-Clark correspondences. There's a few essential writings. His Leibniz-Clark correspondences are among the essential, where he's refuting the entire Newtonian way of thinking, method of thinking that is encouraged. And Samuel Clarke is kind of like, Clarke is to Newton what Thomas Huxley was to Darwin, for example. They wouldn't really let Newton go out in public very much. In the same way that
because he was a weirdo.
Well, he was a little like hyper autistic and couldn't really put into words the thoughts that were being attributed to him. So there was a certain marketing campaign around creating an image of him to as almost like a scientific godhead that was more than human. But when you actually look at it, and Leibniz actually gets at that in a variety of ways, a lot of the discoveries that are attributed to Newton as the great genius of geniuses, because fruit fell on his heads, were actually stolen from people who had published their works long before Newton and were simply repackaged without the spirit of the discovery in the form of the shell of the formula. But Newton himself was, by and large, his passion was located in alchemy and numerology and the occult. That was like his.
Yeah, he spent too much time in his experimental room sniffing mercury, mate. That's where his autism comes from.
Yeah. That was his everything. And from what I've read as well, like Descartes as well had a certain occult alchemical passion. Now, what I've encountered is that there are sort of two. When Leibniz or Kepler talk about the ancients, they're looking at things that are intelligible. So, like, for example, they'll talk about Euclid, but they'll do it through, for example, Kepler talks about Proclus, and Proclus who was a Pythagorean during the Roman Empire period. Proclus had a series of commentaries on Euclid's books. Now, the difference between Proclus and Euclid is actually taking you through. He's acknowledging that the conclusions Euclid has are correct conclusions by and large, but Proclus identifies that the way that Euclid is encouraging you to think cannot allow you to come to those conclusions. And Proclus is instead giving you more of a constructive geometrical approach to appreciating the cause of these ideas. And so Kepler spends a lot of time studying and encouraging his students to study Proclus, the Pythagorean, and the Pythagorean school more genuinely. The other opposing school against people like Kepler and Leibniz, which finds itself within the Cartesian Newtonian school of the mechanists, the mechanists, they're trying to say oftentimes, yeah, there is ancient knowledge that goes back into deep history, but it's located through alchemical occult irrationalism. And it's purely through various, Eleusinian mysteries and things like that we can cleanse ourselves of, you know, reason and come to real true knowledge of the essence of things. But it gets into very black magic-y shit. Like it gets
Yeah.
really nasty. Whereas the
They're
other,
looking
sad.
for some kind of a hack or a shortcut.
Sadly.
well, it's like it doesn't actually get you there. It's like it's
That's
giving you
right.
the sense of grandiosity that you're tapping into some like secret knowledge for the inner elites, but it's only the illusion of it. It's not the essence of it. And that really does seem to create a seed of corruption in the mind of somebody who goes into that place and thinks they have knowledge, you know, that makes them superior than the normies, the sheep, you know, that they're part of the master class to rule over the shadow cave people. But yeah, you get a sense of that very clearly. Again, when you're reading some of these things, like especially Leibniz's writings on dynamics and how people like him are always trying to make it intelligible to the mind of everybody, how the steps that they took mentally in going from ignorance of something that they're trying to seek to knowledge of it, that eureka, they try to replicate in their writings for their students and the people who will come after them, the ability to experience those mental actions, the way Socrates does in the Meno dialogue, by just taking you through, like, no matter who you are, even like thousands of years in the future, if you try to double the surface area of a square, just try to, you got a square. If you try to take that square and double the surface area of that square and keep it a square, so the identity of squareness is preserved, the actions that your mind will take, the mistakes that you're going to make, and then the corrections you're going to make will be pretty much the same thing. And the first thing that people will do oftentimes is like, well, I got to double the surface area. What's the first thing you're going to do? Throw something at me.
Or 3 more
The
squares.
first mistake will be to double the length and width.
Well,
And
first
then
you
they
double
say,
the,
"Oh,
yeah,
that's
first
way
you
too
double
big."
the length, right? You're like, okay, I got to double the area. So I'm just going to like double the, I'll do that.
Right, if you double that, then you lose squareness.
Yeah. And I accomplished half of my task. Now it's 2, but it's no longer a square. It's a rectangle. So I missed the objective. So what's the next thing you do? Do you want to keep it a square? So what do you do to make that become a square?
The first iteration would be to replicate what you've done there. You put 2 blocks on top of the 2 blocks you've got, or
And it's a
below
square,
it.
right?
So
It's a square.
It would
So
still
then
be
you
square.
got a square, right? Bam, I just made a square. I just doubled that. So now it's a square.
but it's 4 times the
Area.
surface area which you started with, which meant you overshot the mark.
You overshot the mark. So again, you hit one, missed the other mark. So how do you satisfy both of those objectives? Double as well as maintain squareness. If this is your first starting square, what's the solution? And if you
Well, I
already know
would
the
have gone
answer,
out at an angle from each corner, but I'm not exactly sure how to figure out how far.
Well,
I mean, like this.
Exactly.
I did it, Matt, I did it in my head, but I think it's really important to know the steps that you make to lead you to an error, to lead you to the correct.
Yeah. Well, Susie just said something.
Correct end.
Susie just said what? You connected the corners like this?
I would have gone out from each corner at
Yeah.
an angle,
Yeah.
but I'm not exactly sure how far.
Okay.
Well,
Try-
if
Or
you
try
go-
what kind of
if you
formula
connect-
you would use to figure that out.
Matt, if you connect the diagonals as Susan is recommending, and you go out at a 90-degree angle from each time, you will get the square with double the surface area. Because I mean, if you do math from, well, we learned this. If you learned the Pythagorean theorem a long time ago, you can figure it out that the diagonal is going to be the square root of 2 if the length of your length and width are 1.
So
And then you'll wind up with
this is
a,
1 and that's 1.
so then your diagonal is going to be the square root of 2.
And you could prove that how?
Well, that's Pythagoras.
You don't need
speaking.
Pythagoras, because like 1
Okay.
times 1 is 1,
one.
right? So the
There's
area of
Fibonacci proceeding. Yeah. It's like Fibonacci numbers. You start
Yeah, don't
with
worry about
one,
that
you
yet.
go-
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
But in this case, it's just that the area is a square of 1 when the sides are 1.
Yes.
But you're saying here, if you take the diagonal, which could have been here as well, it could have been the same size outside of your first square if you wanted it to be, right? Like Susie's impulse was to go outside the square. Oh, I'm running out of pen ink. Okay. So I could have gone outside it, but if we go inside the square to the diagonal and we just connect it to this diagonal, right? Connect to that diagonal,
Yes,
connect to that diagonal.
we'll have a square.
Well, now you got a square. What's going to be the area of that square? What's that area going to be?
Okay, I
units.
see it.
It'll
Huh?
be two.
Two. Yeah, that's backwards. Sorry. So then you get a sense that the square root, if you wanted to get this, what's the side of if the square's area is 2, what's the side of the square? It's going to be square root of 2, right?
Okay, so hold on. So your first steps that you did, even though they were mistakes,
Mhm.
they stay there and they lead you to the correct answer.
Yes.
Yeah, your mind,
Okay.
and that's exactly what the mind of the Mino's slave that child went through those exact same hypotheses in that exact same way. And that's exactly what I did a decade ago when I was first confronted with this. My mind exactly did those two things too. And I never read the Plato dialogue, but it's my discovery. And I had to make those mistakes in order to have the clear field to know what I was ignorant of in order to fill that space with knowledge. Right. And then,
So this right here is what you were talking about in some interview that your math teacher made you go figure it out.
well, it was my math teacher. My math teacher wasn't so good, but I had somebody who was a better teacher that I just met in life who told me go figure it out, and that was good. Yeah. And then like Peter was
Some
saying,
of the mental gymnastics you guys lead me through, I just gotta kind of hang on for the ride and hope my brain is growing.
it is.
Yeah, I'm with you,
for sure.
Susan.
What's cool too, like Peter was saying, is if you continue this process of growth out and you double that square to make it a bigger square still, right? So now you got a bigger square that's double that square of 2. Now it's going to be a square of 4 of area 4, right? And the side is going to be 2. Now you're dealing already with a basic type of like the most elementary logarithmic function you could imagine. This is so messy, but whatever. I'm doing this backwards. But essentially, it's like this, right? Like I've just created. I need to get a whiteboard. You just gotta. What's happening here is you're doubling something in a linear way, the side, and you're also doubling the area. So you got a 1-dimensional and 2-dimensional growth function happening, right? Which is giving you the most essential form of logarithmic growth function, and a self-similar one at that, right? Every single triangle growing maintains the same identity, and every single square growing maintains the same identity as the one that is smaller to it. So something you've got to, and you can imagine that going on forever into the big and into the small. So you have essentially, if somebody tried to discover the Pythagorean theorem without going through that step, it wouldn't be a full discovery. And if somebody tried to discover the golden section, right, the place where like the side of a rectangle, that special rectangle that has a sweet spot where the side of one is to the side of the other, like A is to B, where B is to A plus B, that special sweet spot. If you try to discover that, why it's true without going through this basic step, you can't skip steps. It wouldn't be a discovery. Your mind has to build a foundation upon which deeper discoveries can happen in a lawful way. And they will be rooted. Whereas if you skip steps, it'll just be memorizing formulas and not knowing why they're true. And then that opens up the door to all sorts of witchcraft, because you don't know what you're dealing with. You're just dealing with symbolism, right?
I thought of a way that you could physically validate what you did when you were with the exercise of going from a square of area 1 to a square of area 2 by making those 2 mistakes. We went to the 1x2 rectangle, then we went to the 2x2 square, which was bigger than our needs. Then we had the Susan's diagonals, and it got us to it. And you could physically validate that if you folded the triangles to the center. And you said, okay, that which I folded into is the same as that which I folded onto. You know,
Yeah.
it's half of 4 is 2. I think I got it.
Yeah, man. Yeah, for
There
sure.
was
Eureka.
something that Dr. Lee said earlier about, I think it was him, about, I think the science with the soul or the science without the soul. And I think he said, what's the difference? And the difference is life or absence of life. Because the system of the formulas without that soul factor present, there's no life in it. And so there's no growth in it for the human being. But that's
Absolutely.
exactly what they've set in place. And it just seems like the whole purpose of so much of what we discussed even tonight is they don't want to admit that God exists because they want to be God.
Oh,
And so they want to keep us as fragmented and compartmentalized and dumb as possible so that we won't grow up and overcome them.
that's the final conclusion, Susan.
Okay,
No,
so
no,
I guess
and-
my brain is growing.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you know, when you say science with life, you know, even in a child or in a teenager, a young man or a man, it's called the eureka moment, okay? When you're so happy that you discover the root of that reality. And you know that's a representation, and there can be another representation, okay? So that's the aristocratic man for Plato, okay? A woman, okay? Playful exploration. And that goes into infinity and eternity.
Mhm.
And an aristocratic man or an aristocratic people cannot be enslaved because there is that deep joy and deep fun in their life.
Yeah, and you'll find like what Kwan just said is really antagonistic to how Plato is generally taught nowadays, because you'll even find that many of the worst elements of the oligarchy tend to often appreciate very much what Plato does, especially in his Republic, but in other places too. But the thing about them, when they talk about Plato, they are speaking from an extremely Aristotelian vantage point. They're interpreting Plato as if they were looking through the lens of Aristotle in a literalistic way. And Plato talks about the aristocratic man. He talks about the golden souls, the silver souls, the bronze souls, the brass souls, right, as a hierarchy of souls. Now, the difference is Plato, and you can only get this by looking at all of his dialogues, like read all of his dialogues. You get a sense that he doesn't believe in a fixed hierarchy. He believes very clearly, but he will tend to not say it. He wants the reader to come to this conclusion on their own, that everybody can become ultimately a golden soul. Golden souls are not something you're born into based on your family or your blood or whatever. It's based on the fact that you have worked through, you've become a true philosopher. You've become a philosopher king in that sense. You love truth more than your life. And you have that playfulness. You have that nonlinear, sort of quality. And you can always be better. At no point is there like a ceiling to like having hit, now I'm the best. Now I'm perfect. That doesn't exist in Plato's world. That's why all of his dialogues don't finish. They're all sort of these open-ended, well, what do you think? And that's how they all end is, now, what do you think? The answer is to what is justice. He doesn't give you the answer. Whereas somebody like a lesser mind would try to give you a crystallized, finished answer and give you the false conceit that you somehow had true knowledge of something you just memorized, a definition for. So if that's the case, and that's the idea of the aristocratic personality, is it just means the best, right? The aristocrat is not like the low-level plutocrat, which is how we're often taught today. It's right. The elite, the degenerate is the aristocrat. No, it's not it. It literally means the best type of person. And that just means somebody who's, again, found a love for wisdom, which is that high. And that's the point of a republic. That's what Benjamin Franklin said to the, when he was asked, what did you create for us? And he says, a republic, but only if you can keep it. So throwing it back subjectively onto the citizen, both in his time, but also in all time, that a republic it only works if everybody is working to become better. If that yearning disappears for whatever reason, you don't have a republic anymore. It loses the life force. It just becomes a husk, right? Which either requires then Martin Luther King Jr. or John F. Kennedy or somebody to bring it back to its founding principles. Or if you don't, that's what happened to Rome when Cicero was killed. It went empire, and then it just created the seeds of its own destruction, and that was lawful. So we're sort of in that state today where we have some choices to make, and definitely there's certain leaders of the world. Unfortunately, they're not in the transatlantic area, who are of a much more aristocratic quality and are unwilling to sacrifice their people and their cultures on some stupid altar. And so we have to sort of take the best of our lessons right now of what we can learn from what made our society viable in the past, of this Platonic, this tradition that was. It is still there. We just have forgotten that it's there, but it's there. It's real, and bring that more to the front.
Yeah.
I
And I
have a
want
quick
to
question for
add that-
Kwan. Anyway, when Kwan finish, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, what Kwan just mentioned about playfulness and a joy for exploration, right?
Yeah.
The question directed to Kwan to specify a little more. Is this what drives curiosity, or is it just that it is a sign of intellectual humility?
Yes, well, intellectual humility is only a consequence of the joy, okay? Because a true morality cannot be stuffed in your mind, okay? The energy has to come from a deep joy, and that deep joy, Plato called it dialecticon, okay? If you read the Republic, he will give a name for each epistemological stage, okay? For example, he will call the sense perception eikasia, meaning the shadows. He would call mathematical's formula dianoa 1, and he would call the epistemological stage of playful exploration dialecticon. Okay, that's the meaning of dialecticon, playful exploration. And that's an attitude that if you have a true education, okay, if you have true teachers who are philosopher kings or almost philosopher kings, they will not teach you the formulas, but they will teach you the playful process through which you discover stuff, okay? A little bit like in the dialogue, in the Meno dialogue, when Socrates asked the right question to the boy slave. And because he was capable, because Socrates was a philosopher king, he was capable to ask the right question to someone who was not schooled at all, a boy slave. But because of those perfect right questions, that human being having a sovereign mind was capable step by step to get at the right result. Okay, so and I'm sure that that boy slave must have felt something extraordinary in his heart and his mind. I'm quite sure that his master sold him after that, because it would not be capable to keep him down after that, okay? Because he tasted something of the eternity of his soul. And that is precisely that playful exploration which defines the aristocratic man or the aristocratic people, because they see the universe as a playground. And when you have it, morality is something that will happen spontaneously to you, okay? Because someone who is so joyous, so happy, cannot be a murderer, cannot be a liar, cannot be a bully, okay? It's a simple consequence. When you're in love, you will not do bad things. You don't need to be preached to not to do bad things. And that's true classical education.
Right. Right. Well said. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the gets at the problem with Kant and the difference between Kant's thinking on this matter and somebody like a Leibniz who believes in felicity as a natural state, the love of doing good and loving good. That's Leibniz's view of felicity and the human experience, is to just be that when we're in our natural healthy state. Whereas Kant is of the view that no, we always kind of want to be hedonistic beasts, but we must always whip ourselves to do good as our duty, as part of our imperative, but we could never love doing good. It's always something that we're forcing ourselves to do, which is really, you get the right behavior maybe, but you don't get any of the freedom or sovereignty or love or playfulness out of that.
Yeah. And there's a modern expression which is quite perfidious, okay? Fake it until you make it, okay? It doesn't work like that, okay? It doesn't work like that. And maybe for physical exercises, maybe, but not for the mind. And if you want a true example of a fake democratic man playing the gentleman for the oligarchy, just go on YouTube and just write Jeffrey Sachs, okay? And you study Jeffrey Sachs and you have the perfect fake democratic man serving the oligarchy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is a smaller Kissinger, because Kissinger is a bigger one.
Yeah. Now he's still pretty intelligent as far as assets of the oligarchy are concerned. He knows, he's one of the few who knows what he's doing. He knows what he's a part of, and he's pretty good at it. And frankly, to the degree that he continues to say we shouldn't go to nuclear war, good. Good.
Well, he make a video lately and sponsored by the New York Times. Okay, sponsored by the New York Times. It's Confucius and Aristotle. Okay, it's a masterpiece of perfidy.
Is that with the one with Ban Ki-moon playing?
Yeah, exactly. And Ban Ki-moon was so bad that, of course, it has been created to put Sachs to the forefront. It's obvious.
I gotta watch that. I'm gonna watch that tonight. That sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. Guys, all right, this is good. This is a very soulful, good experience. Love these two Wednesday night things. So next Sunday, this coming Sunday, I should say, is going to be Pascal doing something pretty fresh on the battle between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, and what the hell was Thomas Jefferson exactly? As somebody who wasn't really, you can't say he was evil, you can't say he was good. He's something of a bit of a tragic personality who at different times did good things and at other times did horribly, viciously bad things, which continued to live through and reverberate to our present age, confusing a lot of people. So Pascal's going to do that on Sunday. I think after that, I believe, Quan, am I right? Is that your class the following Sunday after that?
Yes, it will be on November 6th, so it should be after that.
Sweet. Okay, good. All right. So we got a lot cut out for us. Next week, we'll continue on this paper, and I'm sure this is going to be many, many more weeks of these types of discussions to come. So take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye now.